Hey all, hope all's well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 6 game from the Marshall GM IM Invitational. Now, if you've followed the last few videos, you know I've lost 2 games in a row in rounds 4 and 5, and both of them were really heartbreakers where I was really in it right towards the end and then kind of fumbled the ball. And so I was hoping to change my fortunes in this round. Now, my opponent was Grandmaster Djurabek Khamrakulov, a Grandmaster originally from Uzbekistan, who's been in the United States for the past few years, and very, very formidable opponent. So, very tough guy to rebound against, but I was hoping to do that. Anyways, I opened with d4. He played knight f6, knight f3, e6, and e3. And if you've seen any of my games in this tournament already, you know that I've been toying around with this d4, knight f3, e3 system. Perhaps a little bit too much, frankly, but it is what it is. c5 was Djurabek's choice. I think this is one of the more aggressive ways to treat the system because you're delaying the advance of the d pawn and trying to, challenge my center very quickly, almost in like a Sicilian type of fashion. Very, very sensible way to play. I went bishop d3, and now d5 is played now, which kind of has a threat of c4 in some positions, taking more space and challenging my bishop. Because of that, I went b3 because I didn't want to allow this c4 move. But yeah, it's just a position. I think in many ways, this is the type of setup that a black player might get. Like the side that's playing, I'm playing white now. It's almost like a black setup with white. Playing d3, bishop b2, having e3, d4. It's a very, very modest setup, but the idea is kind of just to develop your pieces and see what happens. Knight c6 was played, and now I castled. One of the benefits of playing this e3 system is that you typically castle very quickly, and you can just, not worry about that. And queen c7. Queen c7 was a little bit puzzling to me. I was extremely surprised by this move because I thought moving the queen this early doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you want to develop and castle, right? Well, I think one of the ideas behind queen c7 is what I talk about all the time, which is the not having your bishop get to a square without making 2 moves. So if you play bishop e7, for instance, instead of queen c7, and now I take, it took the bishop 2 moves to get to that c5 square. So instead of that, black is arguing, I'm going to play queen c7, and you don't have a useful move but to take on c5 eventually. So that's what I'm counting on. So I kind of agreed with that. I mean, I didn't want to give the bishop the chance to go to c5 in one go. So I decided to play a3, essentially a really, really interesting waiting move, goading black into moving the bishop so that after I could take and then play b4. But I played bishop d6, and I actually went bishop b2 because I actually realized when I got to this position that it didn't make a lot of sense to take on c5. Point being is that if I take on c5 right away and go b4, the bishop can drop back to d6. And truth be told, I don't have good coverage of the e5 square then now that my d-pawn is gone. So black can play a move like knight e5, which challenges my bishop, challenges the knight, and if after a potential recapture on e5, would challenge my rook on a1. So I was not particularly enthusiastic about ceding the center once I got here. So because of that, I decided to keep the tension with bishop b2. Black played bishop d7, and this was truly shocking to me because I was like, why don't you just castle? What's the delay? And I thought, okay, now that bishop d7 has been played, maybe I could take advantage of that delay. And I went knight c3. The knight is very, very unusually placed on c3. It's not normal course of action. But my argument was that I'm threatening the knight b5, which is threatening to win a bishop pair by forking the queen and bishop. And by getting this move in, I'm actually, helping my control of the center. Even though this knight is in the way of the bishop, my rationale was that if the center opens up, my knight might be well placed here. So after knight c3, a6 is kind of forced. You don't want to give up the bishop pair. And then I went d takes c5, bishop takes c5, and e4. And here was my big idea, was to provoke a skirmish in the middle of the board while the king was still stuck in the center. So, and then my other argument was, well, this bishop on d7 doesn't make a lot of sense. So d4 is played. I think that makes a lot of sense. If you castle, you're giving yourself an isolated pawn. So this type of position, black could be fine in, but it's like you don't necessarily want to do this because structurally, in the long term, I have two islands to black's 3. So that makes sense not allowing that. So he decided to play d4 and take space in the center. But I was kind of cool with this because it meant that I get to attack the d4 pawn further and the king is still stuck in the middle. So to attack the d4 pawn further, I went knight e2. And now you see I have 3 pieces trained against that d4 pawn, and black has 2 defenders. So I thought, okay, now black has to do something about that. And black played e5. And I was like, okay, the pawn is solidly defended here, but now I got to attack the center even further. So I played b4 to challenge this bishop on c5. And after bishop a7, I played c3. And my idea is I'm going to continue to totally rake this pawn across the coals, attack the center, and that's going to be my counterplay where black is not castled yet. So even though I might not have any advantage here, I was pretty happy with what had transpired because of this bishop d7 move, I managed to get a lot of counterplay in the middle. Black played d takes c3, logical. I went knight takes c3, and now black finally castled. And the dust is settled, and it's probably about equal position. I mean, at the end of the day, we both developed. In fact, black actually has their rooks connected before I do, which is, not great. And black has really good control over the d4 square, which is kind of frustrating. This bishop on a7 is actually doing a great job on this diagonal. And so I thought I can't really tolerate a knight coming to d4. So I decided to throw in knight d5. And my idea here is that my bishop and knight are unleashed on this e5 pawn, and now the queen is hanging. And if you take on d5, then the e5 pawn is a little bit loose. So I thought I was just in time with getting counterplay against black's center. Knight takes e5 is played, e takes d5, and then knight d4. And I must say I was a little bit surprised by knight d4 because I didn't see it initially in my calculations. I thought that the d4 pawn would be a little bit weak here. But what you see is that after knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop takes, e takes, and this is all pretty much forced, is that this d5 pawn is just as weak as this d4 pawn. So it's kind of like these pawns kind of offset each other in terms of being weaknesses. Now, the one thing I did like about my position is I thought my bishop on d3 is on a better diagonal than black's. Black's bishop is not really hitting anything meaningful. And I also figured that this is an opportunity for me to get a tempo on the queen because it's my move. So there are ways you could try to recover the pawn, but I didn't think they were particularly smart. Like if I try to go like bishop c2, for instance, trying to attack this pawn, I thought black would go queen c3. And just a good job eyeing this, protecting the d4 pawn, eyeing the bishop on c2, and if I try to go rook c1 and get clever with discoveries, then my a3 pawn hangs, and my queen side is very weak now. So I was kind of keen on noticing that this queen c3 move is very, very annoying. So because of that, in this position, I decided to play rook c1 to challenge the queen on c7, and I thought that made a lot of sense. The queen moved to e5, now attacking my d5 pawn. And, I could make a move like queen f3, but again, I thought the c3 square was a little bit too sensitive. So if I go queen f3, I thought rook a c8 would be strong. And then the point is that there's the rook c3 as a threat. And then using the d4 pawn and the c3 square as an anchor, black could double on the c-file. If you've watched my video series, Chess Secrets You Wish You Knew, you know how I talk about using pawns as anchors to double your rooks, and this would be a prime example. So I didn't like this line, and so after queen e5, instead of playing queen f3, I decided to play rook e1 and hassle the queen again. And you might say, well, that's a very unusual, aren't you just giving up the pawn? Well, I am, but the point is that now my rooks are both very active, and I can recover the pawn. I went bishop e4 now, challenging this queen on d5. And now that you can see that I'm hitting the b7 pawn after it, and the queen has to make a tough decision. Black went queen d6, backing up the queen. And I can take this pawn on b7, but I figure that after bishop takes b7, a move like rook e8, black probably, or even rook d8, frankly, black probably liquidates here because I didn't see any good ways to put more pressure on this pawn. And the thing is this pawn looks a little weak, but if I make a move like queen d3, black has bishop b5, reinforcing it and hitting the queen. So I thought that wouldn't be a good idea, and my bishop would be a little offsides. So after queen d6, I instead went rook c4. And the point is that this pawn is still a target, and if I can get the d4 pawn with tempo, that would be great. So black very alertly did not want to allow my rook to double on d4 and put pressure on the d7 bishop. And so he went for d3, and I think that's a good move, because now you don't allow my rook to double. I went bishop takes d3, which is a better move than queen takes d3, I thought, because it introduces this bishop takes x7 discovery check threat. So black has to deal with that and went for g6. But at least now, if you look at the position, the material's equal, but I'm slightly more active than white because my rooks are already on open files. And then the other thing I was thinking about was that in endgames, the a6 and b7 pawns are on light squares, and we have light squared bishop. So I thought my pawn structure on the queen side was slightly better than black's pawn structure on the queen side. So I thought white should have a tiny, tiny advantage here, and I try to put that to good use. I play bishop e4 now, trying to trade the queens and still putting pressure on the b7 pawn. Queen takes d1 was played, rook takes d1, and I was like, okay, great, I'm back in business now because this pawn is a problem, this bishop is a problem, and it's kind of hard to defend everything. Black played bishop e6, which is a good move, attacking my rook with tempo. And I went rook c7, trying to put more pressure on that pawn. And now black went rook a d8, good move, challenging my rook on d1. The one flaw in my position right now is that I have back rank problems, so I'm going to have to waste a move giving myself back rank problems. And so I can't just rush to take here because there's rook d1 mate. So I went rook dc1 to decline the trade of rooks and still put the pressure on the b5 pawn. Black went bishop d5, trading these bishops and saying, you know what, I'm going to give you this pawn, but I'm going to be super active in an endgame with my rook, so I'm not so worried about it. And I thought, okay, there's a fair point. You probably are very active, but I'm a pawn up in a rook endgame, and I can't lose, and I'm going to try and make the most of it. So I went bishop takes d5, rook takes d5, and then rook takes b7. And here's actually the first really critical position of the game, because again, I'm a pawn up, but I have a little bit of a weak back rank, and black's rooks will be pretty active. So it's a question of what's going on here. And the move that black played, which I had seen, was rook fd8, which is a very annoying move because it threatens mate. And so a normal move you might consider here is a move like g3. But the issue with this move is that after rook d1 check, after rook takes d1, and king g2, and then rook a1, I just lose the pawn on a3, and it's just a total draw. And then the material's equal, and there's nothing going here. So in this position, I wanted to find a way to keep the game going without it being totally stale. And so if you want to pause the video and find a way, white to move, to keep the game going and keep the pressure on black, I think it's a really, really instructive way to do that. All right, I hope you paused the video. I hope you got some time to think about it. The move I played, and I was actually surprised at how strong it was actually rook e1. The point is that after rook d1, which was played, I now can play king f1. And the beauty of this move is my king comes to the center, and if you trade on e1, now you can't infiltrate with with rook d1 and rook a1 coming in from behind. So you have to attack the pawn horizontally, but after rook d3, I can play a4, and after rook a3, a5, and I solidify my pawn structure here, and now I have serious winning chances because the a6 pawn is weak. So I thought rook e1 was a star move, and I was very proud to find this one. After rook d1, king f1, Black played rook 8 d3, and the point was he's still attacking this pawn, and if I trade again, we have the same problem where he can defend the pawn from behind, and I can't cover it. So after rook 8 d3, I went a4 to get my pawn up to a5 where it could be well protected. Rook d2 was played, trying to get counterplay along the second rank. It makes a lot of sense. And I went for rook e8 check. This was one of my key ideas, was that I wanted to play rook e8 check, force the king to g7, and then I sometimes have rook e7 ideas, hitting the pawn on f7 with check. But the point was that after rook e8, king g7, my idea was not to go rook e7 right away because that allows this rook d1 check stuff and a repetition. The idea was to go rook e3. And the point is that from e3, I'm challenging this rook, and if he declines to trade, I could go rook f3 and get the pawn like this. So I thought this was a very, very strong move. The other point is now if rook d1 challenging my king on f1, now I can step up to f3, and my king here is secure and shielded from checks. And I still have this 2 versus 1 on the king side. So yeah, so I managed to make some real headway here, and surprisingly, it's not very easy for Black to defend. Rook takes f3 was played, and after f takes e3, rook a2, and a5, it actually turns out that this position is actually winning. It's just winning position for Black because Black really has to worry about this f7 pawn, and the a6 pawn is also very weak. Black played rook b2, which is a reasonable move, keeping an eye on the b4 pawn and freezing my rook on b7, because if I go for this pawn, this is closer to a draw than a win because the rook can get behind the pawn, and it's very difficult for me to make use of the a-pawn. So I didn't want to lose the b-pawn for the a-pawn. I wanted to try and win the a6 pawn without losing the b-pawn. I went rook b6 here just to keep an eye on the a6 pawn and to make sure that the rook on b2 is frozen, because now if the rook ever moves away from the b file, I can just take the a-pawn. And now Black went for f5, because now that my rook has moved away from the 7th rank, the pawn is free to move and take some space. And here's actually the critical position, because my king is cut off, for sure. My king is cut off on the first rank, which is unfortunate. But this rook is also pretty, frozen because it has to keep an eye on the b pawn. And it turns out that white is winning here through a very, very precise maneuver. So it might be a good idea to pause the video here and try to think about what is the long-term plan for white to win this rook endgame, which is winning. It is a winning rook endgame, but it's not so easy to convert. All right, hopefully you had a moment to think about what the right plan is. I did start with the right first move, but I was not able to figure out the following moves correctly. So essentially the plan, before I make any moves, the plan is you want to walk your king to b2 and challenge this rook, because the rook only has 3 squares on this file to continue to attack the b4 pawn. So you want to challenge the rook, you want to get your king to c1, then it can only go, once it gets to c1, the rook can only go to b3, and then you go king c2 and the rook has no squares on the b file, and then you're able to capture the a6 pawn. But the key thing is you don't want to lose all your pawns before you run your king over. So the move you start with is h3, and I actually started with h3, which is good. And Black's in a real tough spot, because if Black does nothing, you can walk your king along the way. So Black went king h6, trying to get counterplay, walking the king in. And here's actually where the position is critical. what I played was king g1. I thought that if I hide my king on g1 and go king h2, king g3, and king f3, I thought that by putting my king on f3 and pushing the g-pawn then, I would be able to make progress on the king side. But it turns out the best move here, strangely enough, instead of king g1 and king g5, which actually happened, the best move is g3. And the point is that after g3, this king can't get forward anymore. It can't break through. It can get to g5, but it can't go further than that. So now after you play g3, the king can actually run towards the queen side. So just for an example line, king g5, king e1, h5. Black's trying to create a weakness here so that the king can actually get in. King d1, h4. I can capture that. And then king c1, and lo and behold, my king has arrived and the rook has to make a decision. Rook b3, fair enough, attacking the e-pawn, but now king c2, and after rook takes e3, rook takes a6. This position is actually winning because you pushed a pawn with f4, fair enough. I play rook f6, getting my rook behind the pawn as quickly as possible. And then after f3, I can push my own pawn, and my pawns are just too fast, especially since they're connected. The line continues, rook e2, king b3, stopping the rook from going to a2. f2, a7, rook e3 check, king a4, hiding my king away. Rook e1, threatening rook a1 check, and we allow it anyway by going rook takes a2, rook a1, king b5, takes, and then the very key move in this position, rook f3. And the point is that with the rook on f3 and the pawn h3, this construction prevents the king from coming forward and attacking the rook. And so this rook protects this pawn, and it can't be attacked. And in the meantime, this king could walk up the board with the b pawn, and it's just a technically winning endgame. Just to give you an example, let's say g5, king b6, rook a1, b5, just let's say something like this happens, and king c6, checks, and there's no way to make progress here because I'm just going to slowly move my pawn up the board. And if you try to trade pawns, this becomes very easy because now I can go rook c3. This king is going to be cut off on the c file, and then I can shield my king from checks but with this rook, and this becomes an easy win. So because of that dynamic, it's actually totally winning if I play that very precise move order. Now, g3 seemed it's so counterintuitive to leave your whole second rank bare like this and just make a run for it. But the thing I had to understand was because my pawns are so far advanced, it's okay that I give some of these pawns away to make those pawns on the queen side run. So that was the opportunity, and I missed it. I went king g1, and after king g5, king h2, but now black plays f4, and it's a very important move, f4, because once these pawns are traded, black can also check horizontally on the third rank, which makes it very difficult. And the thing is, I have to trade these pawns because now f3 is a threat. So I took king takes, and then went rook b7, challenging the h7 pawn. h5 was played, and then I went h4, arguing that, okay, I fixed the pawn on g5, this should be a victory for me. But g5 was a very important move. I think the move I was looking at was king g4, and the point was that if rook b6, king takes h4, I actually have rook takes g6. And the point is that, well, I thought g3 mate would be an option because if rook takes b4, there's g3 mate. But actually, funnily enough, even in this position, after rook takes g6, there's the amazing stalemating trick, rook takes g2. And the point is that after this kamikaze, the king actually has no moves and it's stalemate. So I just overlooked that detail. And but I could go rook takes a6 first. And this was actually the idea is that if rook takes b4 now I have rook takes g6, and g3 mate is a threat. And the rook doesn't seem to have good moves. But even here, there's rook b2. And yeah, this position isn't winnable because if I go a6, again, there's this kamikaze. So amazing, amazing resources that I just missed. After h4, black played g5, which actually makes it much easier because you just trade another pair of pawns. And again, you argue that if it becomes a 2 versus 1 on this side, it's not winnable. I went rook b6, eyeing the a6 pawn again, king f5, and rook takes. And I understood that, yeah, I can't win this position, so I tried to at least transpose to this endgame. But in this one, the black rook gets behind the pawn, and then the king, now the strategy is the king just has to go to the second rank so that I can't check it from behind like this. And black is just in time. So after a6, king g6, a7, and if black is lazy, if black makes moves like rook a5, well, then I have the check on the g8 square, and I can queen. But once the black rook gets to the second rank with king g7, I can't move this rook away and check the king without losing the pawn. So I went king h3, just moving my king up, and king h7, king h2, and we agreed to a draw here because this king could just shuffle, and the rook cuts off my king from coming up the board and helping at all. And so it's just a total draw. Really tough game for me to draw because I think I played pretty well in the middle game to kind of outplay him, get to an end game, a pawn up, and manage to keep some pressure on the position. But right at the critical moment, I was not able to calculate properly to win the rook endgame. And yeah, I tend to think like the endgames are kind of a strong suit, so it's important. It's kind of important that I kind of mess that up because it shows that I have a lot to work on in that department. In any case, it was nice to actually break the losing streak. You know, I had lost 2 games in a row, and it was nice to get on the board with some points, but I definitely missed the mark with the draw. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you can do so by making a donation in the PayPal link below. Thanks.